Good evening. It's a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's McClendon Scholar Program featuring Reverend Jimmie Hawkins, who will discuss his book, Unbroken and Unbowed, A History of Black Protest in America. We're glad to have you with us, whether you're joining us from the Washington, D.C. area where New York Avenue Presbyterian Church is located, or from somewhere else around the country. At our last webinar, we had participants from 29 different states, and I have a sense that that is likely the case again tonight. I invite you to take a moment, some of you have already done so, and go to the chat function, which is down at the bottom of your screen. If you're not familiar with it, after all these times, you may have to look under More and pull up chat. I invite you to go in and to type in your name, tell us where you're joining us from. Maybe if you're with a particular congregation or organization, you might list that too. It's always good to see where folks are from. We look forward to hearing from everybody who wants to sign in, but particularly if you're from out of the DC area, let us know. And you can see Charlotte, North Carolina, and Indiana, and Kansas, and Ann Arbor, Michigan. And just goes on, Los Angeles and Minnesota, Delaware. We really do have a national audience with us tonight, and we're delighted that you're here for this program. Black history is in the news a lot right now, and like much else these days, it has unfortunately been politicized. It's hard to believe that so many people object to telling the full truth about our country's history on race relations, but sadly, that is where we find ourselves today. Fortunately, there are many, many people who will not be deterred from telling the truth and are doing a wonderful job of educating us about Black history and how it is so much a part of all the past that we share. Reverend Jimmie Hawkins' book is an example of this important effort. And we're delighted to have him with us tonight and to have him talking about this book and answering questions about it later in the program. Now, tonight's program was not planned to coincide with Black History Month. Setting this date actually had more to do with Reverend Hawkins' busy schedule than anything else. However, this is indeed a very fitting topic to discuss at this time of the year. And we just want to keep in mind that obviously we shouldn't limit this type of discussion to February, but should commit to an ongoing effort to learn about the history of African Americans, as well as other groups that have been marginalized, ignored, and sometimes abused during our nation's past. In a few minutes, I will introduce Reverend Hawkins, and he will make a presentation summarizing his book and sharing some of its key insights. I will also introduce Don Edwards, who will respond to Reverend Hawkins' presentation and ask him some questions. We'll later expand the opportunity for questions to all of you, and you will be able to use the Q&A function, again at the bottom, right in the middle of my screen bar, but you can see where it's located, and to type in questions there that you have for Reverend Hawkins to answer later in the evening. And I do ask you to keep chat and Q&A separate. If you have a comment or want to continue to share where you're from or something, an observation or a thought or some information, use chat. But for questions, please use Q&A, and I'll be monitoring those and going through them later and pulling out some for us to pose to Reverend Hawkins. As we begin, I want to pause just for a moment for a time of reflection and a brief prayer as we prepare ourselves for this program. So let us pray together. Dear God, we are thankful for all who have gathered together for this program and for Reverend Hawkins' book, which we will have the opportunity to discuss tonight. We are here to learn and to grow, and ask that you calm our minds and open our hearts to new understanding. And most of all, we pray that you will help us learn from the past so that we can be more effective in our work for justice in the present. Amen. I now want to tell you about our two guests for this evening. First is Don Edwards, who is the founder and CEO of Justice and Sustainability Associates in Washington, D.C. JSA is an alternative dispute resolution and community engagement consulting firm that works to create sustainable cities in neighborhoods that work for all. I have had the pleasure of knowing and working with Don for more than 20 years and have constantly been impressed by the work that he does as a facilitator and mediator with both government agencies and large private organizations. After the presentation by Reverend Hawkins, you will meet him then, and he will respond with some comments and then begin the question and discussion period. Of course, our featured presenter for this evening is Reverend Jimmie Hawkins, the director of the Office of Public Witness for the Presbyterian Church USA. He is based here in Washington, D.C., but works with Presbyterians and other church groups across the country, coordinating the PCUSA's response to social justice issues. Reverend Hawkins was a pastor in Durham, North Carolina for 20 years before taking his current position in 2016. And there he became involved with the Moral Monday movement that many of you have heard of, that spread across the nation and became the Poor People's Campaign led by Reverend William Barber. In addition to his work with PCUSA, Jimmie is a board member of the National Council of Churches and is involved with several other interfaith and ecumenical organizations. His book, Unbroken and Unbowed, A History of Black Protest in America, was published last year by Westminster John Knox Press. I'm very pleased to welcome the Reverend Jimmie Hawkins as tonight's McClendon Scholar.
Theo, I want to thank you for that wonderful introduction. I just wish that my wife was here to have heard it. I think it would have benefited our family relations. It's just an honor to be here with you tonight to talk about the book Unbroken and Unbowed, and to just have a general conversation. I'm really looking forward to the last half of our time together as I engage with Don and then with you who are the audience, and to engage and talk about questions, because it is as Theo has said, we really, I think it's more than providential that we did time it so that it came up during Black History Month, because one of my goals, as you will hear during the presentation, is to enlarge our knowledge and awareness of Black history, that it really goes beyond slavery and Jim Crow, that the Black presence in this country has been here since the Spanish explorers came, and Black protest has been a consistent part of that. And it really has impacted this nation in such tremendous ways and in very positive ways. So again, I look forward to this conversation, and I think that we can go ahead and get into the engagement with one another. So I'm going to try to talk to you for about 30 minutes and to see where we come from that. So I just wanted to share, this is our first slide, and you see a cover of the book there. And then as we look at this next slide, I did want to bring out that the artist for the book is a young man named Jerry Lynn, African-American, and he has a twin brother that he paints with. And as I was going through the cover suggestions from Westminster John Knox Press, which is my publisher, they sent me quite a few pictures and layouts at first. And I said, no, they really aren't speaking to me. But then they sent his portfolio. And I love all of his artwork, especially some of his church pictures. He's very almost abstract in some of them, but this one spoke to me because it really captures the essence of the book. You see everything from the top, Black Lives Matter, to the marches going on the left side. And then you see the young lady walking into the school, akin to Ruby Bridges, wherein the mobs are behind her. So I think I wanted to just introduce the cover to you and give you a little background on that as we continue. So my motivations for this book. really to redefine how Black protest is defined. Really started this book right in the midst, around 2014, when Colin Kaepernick was at the height of his protests with, he was a quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers. And as I listened to the protest, people began to burn his jersey. And I was thinking, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard of. You spend almost $200 for a jersey or sneakers, and you're going to set it on fire. And I got a sense that his actions were not really understood, and it was deemed as unpatriotic. And yet when he began to explain it, he says, well, I'm really doing this as a patriotic stance. When a soldier loses a fellow soldier, when he or she is killed, soldiers will kneel as a sign of respect. And that's why he chose to kneel. And so one of the things that I've discovered, Black protest is oftentimes misunderstood. We know about the infamous comment to LeBron James that he should stop talking about social justice issues, especially racial justice issues. He should just shut up and dribble. And oftentimes the response can be quite vitriolic in response to Black protest. So I wanted to talk about Black protests and the nature of it and what its goals are as we go to this next slide. And so then also a secondary motivation for me was to increase knowledge of the Black experience, because again, everyone knows that Black people were enslaved in this country, and many of us who are here lived through Jim Crow. I went to a segregated school my first 5 years of life, and so we know that firsthand. But oftentimes the Black experience is reduced to that. And there's very little known about the Black experience outside of this. So it talks throughout about Black protests, but it also talks about the Black experience. And in the 2 sections of the book, I talk about the experience that Black people were undergoing during slavery, but also during Jim Crow in the latter part of the 20th century. There's little knowledge on the fact that Blacks have engaged in this country on every level. Owners of businesses, clergy, politicians, educators, millionaires, physicians, inventors, nurses, soldiers, etc. And so I wanted to challenge the image of Blacks being portrayed as perpetual victims. We have been victimized in this country, but we never adopted a victim's mentality. There's always been pushback, always been resistance from the days, the first encounter between Europeans and Africans, which was not always of a negative encounter. Because there was a sense of mutuality in the beginning, but during the Middle Passage, we know, and during slavery in this country, it definitely was an oppressive relationship. But Blacks never saw themselves as victims. And especially when you look at the massive resistance of Black people in times when there was not a defined leader. It's amazing the similarities in the protests throughout the Black community, throughout the country. Okay. Now, this book is divided in this next slide. And as we look at these different sections, what's unique about this book and what will be worth your time is that I wrote American history from a Black perspective. And I divided the country into 5 periods based on the Black sense of identity, because the Black identity oftentimes was in response to the protest, and the protest was impacted by the sense of Black identity. So as you look at American history, and the time frame is from the 1440s up until 2020. And obviously, we know the latter part of the 1400s, Christopher Columbus and European exploration, exploitation, as I called it, into the New World began. But the first period is the African period, where the consciousness of Black people was an African consciousness. And next, the colored period, Negro period, Black, Afro-American, and African-American. And as I go through these different sections, you will notice that these are not just the identity titles that were projected onto Black people, but these were the ones that were adopted. Not all of them originated within the Black community, but they definitely became endorsed by the Black community as a form of identifying who we are. So as we look at this first slide, the first section of the book, I entitled it The Age of Exploitation in the New World, African Protests, and the time frame is from 1440 until 1775, and we'll see some more details on this next slide. And so divided into 3 periods, beginning with 1440, the 1440s until 1776. So that period is the period of European exploitation And also it goes right up until the Civil War. I call it the War of Independence. So it talks about pre-colonial life in this country. What was it really like to be have a Black presence here? And again, one of the things I find fascinating is that oftentimes many books will talk about the Black experience beginning in 1619, but the Black experience in America predates that. That's the Black encounter between the English colonials in this country, and when the British began to establish colonies in this country. But we go back to the Spanish and to the Dutch and to the French. And so you'll see that when you go down to St. Augustine in Florida, there was a fort called Fort Mose, which was a Black fort of 100 individuals. That was a barrier between the Spanish colonies, Spanish territory, and the British territories. And so we see that the Black presence here goes back actually much longer, again, to around the Blacks came over with Christopher Columbus, Ponce de Leon. So the Black and the engagement between Europeans and Blacks at that time was not the engagement that you had between Americans and Blacks. It was a much more oppressive relationship in America, but there was almost a mutuality. For we know that many of the civilizations of the world started in Africa, and the Europeans actually modeled many of the institutions that they later developed upon what they saw in Egypt and in all parts of Africa. And so the pre-colonial life, and then colonial America around 1619, we know that that primarily focuses on the British relationship with Africans after 1619. And this last section is one of my favorite sections. I talk about from freedom to slavery. And this again, from 1619 up until 1660. The first Blacks who came here were indentured servants. You usually had between 7 and 14 years wherein you were engaged in almost a slave-like relationship, but it was not slavery, but they could become free. And so when they first came here, they could become landowners. Some of them could vote. And so you begin to see over the period of time, around 1640 to 1661, that's when there's so much revenue being made from free labor that they began to look for sources. We know at first the Native Americans were enslaved. That didn't work because they could easily escape. They knew the territory. And then they brought in Europeans as indentured servants and Blacks as indentured servants. But they wanted constant free labor. So they began to make these laws, starting with Virginia, saying that slavery becomes a racial connection, wherein if you are African, you can be enslaved in perpetuity. You know, some of the first laws said that the status of the child is connected with the status of the mother. So if the mother was enslaved, but all of that happened intentionally. But again, we went, John Hope Franklin book was From Slavery to Freedom. I said, this is from freedom to slavery, because actually there was an element of freedom in the relationship with the first Blacks who came here. And slowly the rules began to change, the policies and the laws were in to be African in the colonies was to be tied to slavery, okay? And so that first period is an African identity, wherein their desire is to get back to Africa. They don't want to stay here. They are first generation Africans, and their determination is to get back. The second section is from 1776 to 1877. Well, these are generations later, and these are Black people who are born in this country, and their desire is to end slavery. And we oftentimes talk about the protest of the insurrection of John Brown, where he wanted to overthrow the institution. This was also John Brown was not the first person to say that. The Africans who started the insurrections, the rebellions, Nat Turner, and we know that Gabriel Prosser and Denmark Vesey, Vesey's goal was to take over the entire city of Charleston and destroy the institution. So their desire is to gain their freedom. And so they say, well, who are we? We're no longer African. We don't want to go, we were not born in Africa. We don't want to go back to Africa. We are colored. And that was a form of pride. You know, we're not white, we are people, and also people of color was one of the identities during that time period as well. And so the protests of the enslaved, they fight back. So let's look at some of the elements in this part. And so I go through, and I always want to set the tone first. So you see conditions of slavery. There are some short sections, about 10 of them, where I talk about what were the conditions of slavery, because you have to understand the protest is molded by the identity, but also by the conditions in which they live. And I really wanted to paint a bleak picture. Slavery is defined by Harriet Tubman. She said slavery is hell. And you were codified. You were a piece of property. You had no rights whatsoever. And it was the most severe form of slavery, the slavery in this hemisphere, and especially American slavery in the world. There was nothing ever seen like American slavery. And I talk about how America started a breeding system wherein slaves, once 1808 and the African slave trade was outlawed, they began to say, well, how can we continue slavery? So we're going to breed human beings and own them, own their children, because again, the status of the mother determined the status of the child. So even if a white man and a black woman had a child, if the mother was enslaved, the child was enslaved. So the conditions were bleak. The auction block, where children were torn out of the hands of their mothers and fathers and sold. And once you were sold, most families did not have an opportunity to gather again. You were lost in slavery. But then there's slave resistance. And I'm really there's an excellent book, Slave Mutinies, that talks about the resistance on slave ships. From the moment they set foot on that slave ship, there was resistance. And also the insurrections that we know about. And so from the very beginning, there was Black protest and resistance. And many of them were determined to be free. The War of Liberation. And so you'll notice the years 1777 until 1866 are the years between the two wars. The War of Liberation, which is my title for the Revolutionary War, which is actually the title for the Revolutionary War. Blacks embraced that war. They saw it as an opportunity to be free. And as a matter of fact, George Washington and the British rejected Black soldiers. And so the British blinked first and says, well, you know, we've got this supply of troops and we don't have a ready supply to get them all the way from Britain. So we're going to recruit Blacks. And tens of thousands, once he announced that Blacks who joined the British side will be guaranteed their freedom, Black tens of thousands joined the British side. And then George Washington finally relented and allowed Blacks into the army, and tens of thousands again. And so Blacks fought on both sides because the promise was freedom. And I've got to say that the British were much more faithful to the promise than the Americans were, because even George Washington, once the war was over, he demanded of the British that you return to us all of the formerly enslaved who have fought for your side, and the British refused and took many of them with them. And then after the war was over, this is a defining period. This entire section is a defining period in American history. It's called the Unfinished Revolution. There really was a sense in this country that slavery would be outlawed once the American Revolution was over, because Blacks criticized the country, saying, how can you fight for your independence and keep people enslaved? And it really had an impact. All of these northern states began to abolish slavery after the Revolutionary War. And much of the conversation is based on slavery, saying, how can we be a country that fought for our own freedom and hold people in chains? And it went from Rhode Island, New York, all of these northern states. But in the South, there was so much revenue being made that they said, you know, no, we're not going to abolish slavery. But the country, and actually George Washington was being pushed by many of his Black troops to be a leader. And George Washington went back and forth. And Lafayette pushed him as well. And we noticed that he struggled with this issue on his deathbed. He freed all of his slaves when his wife Martha died. But there was one, his valet Lee, that he freed upon his death. So it was a time wherein the country could have gone in a different direction, but it chose not to. And then we know about the abolitionist movement. Blacks were the conductors, the ones who, we know the movie Harriet Tubman were the ones who actually conducted people from the South, from the border states into the North. The Underground Railroad, Blacks were very engaged in the Underground Railroad. And then when the war to end slavery, or the Civil War, came to being, again, Blacks were looking forward to this war because they saw it as an opportunity to achieve their freedom, and fought once Lincoln also. Lincoln at first said no, he didn't want to alienate the border states. No Blacks can join. He was pushed by Frederick Douglass and by other Black leaders. And finally, out of necessity, he too engaged with Blacks. And it's very fascinating that both Lincoln and Washington at the end of these two wars said the same thing, that the Black presence, the Black soldiers who fought, were pivotal to the country winning both of those wars. And so then we know about Reconstruction that ended the 10-year period, 1866 to 1877, wherein Blacks began to vote, began to become property owners, even though the 40 acres and a mule that Sherman promised was never fulfilled, began to really fulfill the requirements of citizenship. But once in 1876, 1877, when the federal troops were taken out of the South, the backlash from the South, they blamed Black people for the war. And the violence that was inflicted upon Black people is unimaginable. The tragedy is that during slavery, Black life actually had more worth than after slavery ended, because they had a financial estimation placed on each body. But after slavery, the violence that swept this country, again, is unimaginable, as Black people began to be killed in mass, and not just Black individuals. And so this is the colored section. So let's look at the next section. This next section is from 1878, after Reconstruction, to 1954, right before the Civil Rights Movement. And so this section basically is called Protesting Reconstruction's Failures and Negroes in the New World. And Blacks began to say, well, we're no longer colored, we have a Negro identity. And so they're pushing for full citizenship, okay? And so as we look at this next section, these are some of the sections in this next chapter. The domestic terrorism. Again, it's just unimaginable, the violence that Black people had to deal with in this country. And it really, oftentimes we look at today in the police shootings and things along that line, it was commonplace, the ways in which Black people were murdered during this time period. As a matter of fact, we know about Tulsa, the massacre there in 1921. I just left Springfield, Illinois. They also had a massacre there in 1908. But between the end of Reconstruction up until the 60s, there were massacres. They're called traditionally race riots. They were not race riots. That involved some mutuality, but they were massacres of Black people. And in Arkansas, the largest one had at least 300 Black people were killed within a couple of days. In Washington, D.C., there was a riot. In 1919 has been called Red Summer. 25 American cities erupted in racial violence, wherein Black people were attacked. And mostly it was to stop Black progress. And that's one of the things we have to understand. It's not just that Blacks, once slavery was over, had played on an equal playing field, but every time there was Black progress, there was resistance from the white community. And oftentimes we see sundown towns are established where Blacks cannot live in certain areas. Even where they were living, they were ousted. We have massacres that go on throughout the country. Chicago had a large massacre. And again, it's unimaginable when you read this. And so in this time period, we see that Blacks begin to develop their own institutions. They said, well, if they don't want us to be a part of the community, their communities, we will establish our own communities. You see churches being built, educational institutions, businesses. The Black press comes into being, where really gets at its height during this period. And that's also when Blacks in the South said, well, if you don't want us here, we're going to leave. We're going to migrate not only to the North, but also to the West. And that's a major part of American history that has gone unexplored, the Black presence in the West. If you watch cowboy movies as I did when I grew up, you would think only white people were in the West. 1 out of every 3, as high as every 3, some say 1 out of every 4 cowboys were Black. And also the Hispanic presence has been discounted in the West, and how much what's called the American West really inherited from Hispanics, and especially from Mexican cowboys. And so even the title cowboy has a racial component. Whites were called cowhands, Blacks were called cowboys, and it's Black cowboys, which is stood. The Lone Ranger was Black, Bass Reeves. And so we see the Negro West is an important part of the story. And there are several excellent books, Black and Indians, The Black Frontier, Blacks in the Old West, that really talk about the Black presence in the western part of this country. There were over 400 Negro towns and communities all across the country. Oklahoma had more than any other state, from Maryland, Washington, D.C., Anacostia had a Black community, wherein because of segregation, Blacks built their own community resources. The Harlem Renaissance is probably the most concentrated artistic explosion in the history of this country. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, we have the jazz Renaissance that happened during that time period as well, all coming out of the Black community. Negro soldiers, I talk about how Blacks have fought in every war in the history of this country. from the beginning, even predating the American Revolution, the War of 1812, all of these and Black soldiers. And the tragedy is that they had to put forth the same lesson each time, because each time they attempted to join the military would say, well, the blacks won't fight. They won't fight. And so that's been a sad tragedy, even as far as World War I. The Black presence in World War I would have been 4 times what it was, but the military would not allow them to join other than to work in the mess hall. And we know about, once they were in World War II, the pilots, the Tuskegee pilots, who made a remarkable contribution. And then I call the New Deal the same old deal, because there were benefits to the Black community, but by and large, Blacks were left out of the New Deal. In Southern Dixiecrats, the Southern Democrats intentionally forced Roosevelt to have policies written in so that, one, the control of the New Deal in the South was in the hand of Southerners and not issued and controlled by the federal government. Okay, let's look at the next identity. Now, from 1955, the Civil Rights Movement begins, to 1987. This is the Black period, where the identity is Black. Malcolm X pushed for Afro-American, but it never really caught on. But I will say now there's interchangeability in these titles. They have ebbed and flowed in each period, but these are the dominant periods. And so, you know, during this period, when Stokely Carmichael said, what do we want? Black power, Blacks begin to identify themselves no longer as Negroes, but as Black. And this is a major movement because there were so many negative connotations that with a Black identity, saying that you were Black, because that is really a strong opposite of white. But it's also a strong cultural saying that we are not only, we want full citizenship in this country, but we want our identity recognized. We are people who are of African heritage, who are Black people. And so during this time period, you see a lot of action going on, as we will see in this next slide. The Civil Rights Movement, obviously the greatest movement in the history of this country, incidentally led by church leaders. The abolitionist movement and in the Civil Rights Movement would not have happened without the leadership and the participation of people of faith, the leadership of Black women. I try to talk about that intentionally. There's a section on Black women in the military, a section on the leadership of Black women, because there would not be any protest movement in this country without the leadership of Black women. Youth leadership, I talk about martyrs of the Civil Rights Movement, and every racial demographic lost people to the Civil Rights Movement, the Jewish community, the white community, the Black community, Black women, and then the Black Power movement, the rebellions, especially after 1968, after King was murdered, how we know that many urban cities were set aflame in resistance, saying that we're just sick and tired of being sick and tired. And then Black freedom fighters. Oftentimes we do talk about nonviolence with King, but Black freedom fighters were those who said, look, we're not nonviolent. If you come up to us talking about you're going to kill us, we're going to an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And so this whole period wherein there's a strong sense of protest based on the fact that we are proud of who we are. We are Black people unapologetically, okay? And this last section basically is the African-American identity section from 1988 up into 2020 when the book ends. And so in this section, we shall see that in 1988, and at this next slide, Jesse Jackson gave a speech in New York City, and he said, we no longer want to be called Black, but we want to be called African-American, because it not only has a linkage to the continent of Africa, but also to our culture. We appreciate African culture. And so I really go through, this is more modern period, the political renaissance that happened in the 1970s. We see that's a result of the Civil Rights Movement, where Blacks began to have another rush into political office, very similar to Reconstruction. But once allowed to vote and hold office, Black people just filtrated political offices The African-American vote at this time becomes a block and has a major impact in American voting patterns that we see still exist today. When Blacks went to the North and to the West in cities, they began to impact voting results of elections. African-American literature, this is we see for the first time, similar to the Harlem Renaissance, but for the first time, Blacks began to win awards. So in the Harlem Renaissance, it was really difficult for a Black creative artist to find funding, to be recognized. The NAACP and the Crisis, W.B. Du Bois would publish a lot of poems, a lot of short stories. But for this, the first time, Blacks begin to win Nobel Peace Prizes for literature. It began to be recognized by America. We know the Black exploitation period is during the 70s, but African-American film becomes into its own. And for the first time, Blacks, as they are portrayed in films, are no longer portrayed as buffoons, but they are looked upon for having a level of creativity and appreciation to their work. The Black athlete because it's allowed to play basketball, allowed to play baseball. And what's interesting is that in baseball, we talk about Jackie Robinson in '47, but he actually was not the first Black to play. He was the first, when baseball first started, Blacks played, but then they kicked him out, and then Robinson reintroduces it. Blacks into that theater. And then Black philanthropy, and all of these are elements of protest, because they're saying we do it in order to build up the race, to defeat white supremacy, to show that we are people of capability, that we have, we're wonderful people. And then the new wars on African Americans, this is to give you an idea of what they were fighting against: gentrification, redlining, and we see that the federal government plays a major role in maintaining segregation in this country. And then the 21st, and so then we have the woke life and the social media protests, wherein for the first time, Black protests goes to the forefront. We see with Rodney King, when it's videotaping, it's really being able to record the incidents, especially of police brutality, that white American begins to pay attention and say, maybe because Blacks have always protested against police brutality, but saying maybe there's something here. Then we know the 21st century movements, the Black Lives Matter movement, the LGBTQIA+ movement with the Black presence, and then the talk that we so oftentimes have in Black families about how to negotiate in society. Then I spent a little time talking about Obama and Trump, and then 2020. And so we'll go to the next slide, which ends our presentation for today. But that's kind of an overview of the book. And so you now have an idea. And so again, I look forward to having this engagement with Brother Ron and with you in your Q&A.
Okay, well, Reverend Hawkins, thank you for that magisterial survey of a very important, and not only important, but a thorough examination of the history of African-American protest in the United States. And I want to just start by, first of all, thanking the McClendon Scholars Program and New York Presbyterian Church. In the District of Columbia, New York Presbyterian is known as a stalwart in movements for social justice and freedom. And your program tonight in Black History Month is entirely fitting. And if it wasn't necessarily planned, it appears that the Creator had a bigger plan. So it all came together. Let me just say, before I ask you some questions that I hope will help to illuminate this big lift that you undertook, I would say, first of all, that you are to be applauded for adding to the canon of Black historiography. You and I had a chance in the warm-up to talk about some of our shared background. And it really does please me a lot to be able to place your work in the tradition of John Hope Franklin, From Slavery to Freedom. More recently in the 80s, Vincent Harding's There Is a River. Vincent Harding was one of my mentors. Later on, Joanne Grant's Black Protest again. And then more recently, people like Peniel Joseph, who have, through the lens of the Black Power movements, examined the same terrain. Black protest is not the entirety of African-American history in this country, but it does give us a lens through which to look. And you have, as probably has to be done every generation or so, you have to refocus people, because it's curious to me that we are having this conversation in a month founded by Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who wrote The Miseducation of the Negro. But what your work is doing is contradicting the miseducation of Americans. The problem, of course, is that most Americans do not know that the protest that African Americans have waged, that you refer to in your book, is actually a protest on their behalf as well. You make a very strong point that at no time was it a protest to change the values and principles, the founding and innovating values of the country. It was to ask America to confirm and reinforce those values and principles. And so the protest was never just about Black people wanting to make America something different. What we have been protesting is trying to make America what it said it wanted to be and what it should be. So I just want to credit you and put that perspective so that everybody will leave this program and go out and either order or go to the bookstore and purchase this excellent book. I would end my comment by saying, I think the greatest value of your work is the updating chapter 5. You are the first person I've encountered who has really framed this part of our activity, our protest actions, and incorporated the 21st century, I'll call it the 21st century components. This is especially important because you want to make sure that people see the continuity of the tradition of Black protest, but also to see the adaptation that Black people have been able to develop so that the protests are constantly refreshed. They are standing on shoulders, but they are also looking with a new vision, a larger vision, and a more integrated vision as the contradictions and complexities of America are revealed. So I think I would want to, just before I start with the question, just say thank you for having taken up the challenge of bringing us to the present and giving us a way to have a look at the future as we evolve our understanding of the role of Black protests in this country. So now with that, we talked a little bit earlier about the questions, so I'm gonna start out a little easy, okay? I was struck by the fact that you chose as the title, Unbroken and Unbowed. And of course, that immediately made me think of Shirley Chisholm, first African-American lady to run for president of the United States. And I wondered if you could just elaborate on your selection of that title, because her book, Unbought and Unbossed, to me is very much reflected in your Unbroken and Unbowed. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I was obviously very aware of the title of her book, and she's an inspiration to me. I mean, just her ability to maneuver the political system, her strong spirit, her revolutionary spirit, her willingness to stand up and say, I'm a part of the American civil system, and I will participate whether you want me to or not. But, it's really God-given. And I didn't mention this, but the book started out as an article. I said, well, I'm just going to write an article and see if I can get that published. And I couldn't stop. and I kept writing, and it just kept hitting me. What am I trying to say in this book? That despite all of the oppression, the pain, the suffering, our spirits are unbroken. That we are unbroken, we're unbowed. And that had an inspiration from the bended knee that Colin Kaepernick took as well. But it really kind of came to me and said, well, I want to say that we are still here. We still are not only here, but we're still contributing. So we're unbroken as a people and unbowed. And we have a sense of protest. And I really appreciate the way you framed it from a positive viewpoint. We want America, as Langston Hughes said, to be America. He said, America has never been America to me. And that's really, I think, has been the essence of Black protest, for the country to be a place of justice for all people, where every human being has value. And so that's it kind of evolved. I started out with the original title was A History of African, Colored, Negro, African-American, Black and African-American protests. And the publisher says, well, that's a little wordy. And so, but it evolved into Unbroken and Unbound. And so that's kind of what's my inspiration.
One of the things that you hearken to, and I know that this is part of your life story, is starting out to be a historian, but then you received a call. And I would venture to say that you could probably help us understand the spiritual component that undergirds this ability on the part of Black people in this country to remain unbroken and unbound.
You're absolutely right. And that's something I've got to kick myself after this is over, that I did not talk about the importance of spirituality and the Black church and Black protests in this country. Spirituality has always been intimate to Black protests. And it's amazing that we know that the Africans who were first brought here from the continent came with their own traditional religions, African traditional religions. And they also came with this Islamic religion as well. And so and when they first were introduced to Christianity, they rejected Christianity. They says, no, Christianity is the white man's religion. Christianity is a religion of oppression, because everything that they heard about the Christian faith was, it was almost verbatim the same sermon. Slaves, be obedient to your masters. You obey the governing authorities. God has ordained you to be enslaved, a misuse of Genesis 9 and 10. And so once they began to discover that there were other elements in the faith, and especially in scripture, once they heard about the book of Exodus, which is a story of the freedom of enslaved people in a land of bondage, they slowly began to adopt Christianity, and it became an integral part of Black protests in this country. And so again, I made intentional mention of the abolitionist movement and the civil rights movement were led by people of faith. I mean, it's just no question about this. As a matter of fact, I would dare say that the movements today are the only movements in the history of this country where the Black church, or the church in general, does not play an important role. As a matter of fact, the March for Our Lives movement with young people, they don't look at the church as a partner in this movement. And oftentimes we have got to find a prophetic voice. And so that is the contribution of the Black faith, of Black religion, of the Black church. It has always been a revolutionary, a radical movement. When you look at going back to the days of slavery, it fascinates me that most of the insurrections that were planned or carried out by Black preachers. And during Jim Crow, the Black clergy person was the most revered person in the community, because he or she were engaged in the community. They were free. They didn't have to work at a white company, so they could have a freer voice in the community. Oftentimes they were entrepreneurs. The church, and you may mention sharing with me your experience with the Episcopalian church and the relationship with the schools. For the Presbyterian church, every Black Presbyterian church that was formed in this country, from first African during the 1700s up through, especially after slavery, served as a school and a church at the same time. In the daytime, during the week, they educated children, and then during the weekend, they had worship to God, which was all at the same thing. And so religion, faith, spirituality is integral. And even today, I am really amazed. You know, Pew Research has done polls with Blacks saying that we are the most religious people in this country. We go to church more, we pray more, and it's always been a part of the Black experience. And so I think that we have, and again, going back to the Black church, looking at James Cone, and I make mention of this, I love James Cone, and the father of Black theology. But Cone was reflecting what he experienced growing up. He didn't discover, or, he just basically introduced white people to Black revolutionary theology. So it's always been a part of saying, you do matter. And I close with this story from Howard Thurman. There's a wonderful documentary about Howard Thurman, and he closes it out. He tells a story about his grandmother who was enslaved. And he says she would always tell us about this Black preacher who would come through the plantation. They had two sermons, the sermon that they preached in front of the plantation owners and the sermon they preached to each other. And he says he would always, when he preached to us, would close out his sermon by saying, you are somebody. So you're not a slave. You are a child of God. And it's always been a part of Black faith experience. And again, as you explore the history of Black people in this country, the Black revolution and Black religion go hand in hand.
I'm gonna try and bring it down in a way that allows you to maybe open up your tent door a little bit for us. I'm always interested in the experience, the personal experience that someone I'm talking to has with injustice. When did the dots begin to get connected? At what age? What was the event? How were the formative, what was the formation process that takes place? So I wonder if you could share, growing up in North Carolina, when did you become aware of Black protest? When did you maybe even make your first Black protest? Because I think it's important that people understand that this is not a thing about someone else. This is something that is in all of us. At least I think so. But we have to. There's something that energizes us and makes a connection. I think it would be interesting for folks to hear your story.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I grew up in the church and went to church every Sunday. And the church that I went to was not necessarily at the forefront of Black protests, but it was a place of pride, a place where I was nurtured, a place where I was affirmed and accepted, where people loved me. I mean, unconditionally. And so I began to nurture a sense of identity, a sense of who I was, a person who was special in the eyes of people outside of my family. But I remember when King was killed, I was around 9 years old, and my mother was glued to the television. And I really, at that time, I didn't know what was going on, but I knew that what was happening on television was impacting her. So we sat there together. And I don't even remember the details. I just remember looking at that black and white television, and she sat there motionless the whole time. And so then that impacted me in ways that I did not understand at that time. And so then we would always go into town on Saturdays in Henderson, North Carolina. We had a Woolworth, just like in Greensboro. And we had open access to the Woolworth, except for the lunch counter. Very stereotypical, wherein we could buy food, but we couldn't sit in the seats and buy food. And I remember asking her one day, I said, why can't we ever sit down? She said, well, that's just the way it is. And so I think there was an unconscious element growing within me saying, something's out of kilter here. Something's, and again, I went to a segregated school the first 5 years of my life academically, and we never got new books. All the books we got were secondhand, and all the, you had the little lines where you fill in your names. Those were always filled in. And I still remember, and we would get book covers, those old hardcover brown book covers to make our books look new. And so I think it had a subliminal impact on me saying, again, something's out of kilter here. And so it was really when I went away to college. I went to North Carolina Central University in Durham, North Carolina as an undergrad. And I began to be exposed to Black professors. Again, we talked about Dr. Earl Thorpe, who was the history professor, and Dr. Thorpe did not mince words. That brother, I mean, he and Dr. Bishop and Freddie Parker and other professors there would talk about Black consciousness, Black awareness, and they instilled in me a sense that you have a responsibility, especially by getting a college education, to not only make a way for yourself, but to make a way for others. So I would probably identify those years at North Carolina Central University were in what I had experienced previously I began to be able to articulate. I began to be able to look at it in a way wherein I understood that there was something out of kilter, but that I also had a responsibility to lift up my voice. And so I really, it was almost a slow unfolding. But I remember my first action of protest was in the 80s, when Ronald Reagan was president, and in South Africa, you know, he had this constructive engagement policy, which basically said, we're not going to do anything. We're going to leave it alone. And as they told King, you know, things are changing. Just wait, be patient. We protested a Shell service station because Shell had a horrible, horrible record of supporting of apartheid. And even when other companies finally began to move out, Mobil and Exxon, Shell stayed in South Africa, as far as my knowledge is. And even today, Shell's in Nigeria, and Shell has been a part of, and I've talked with Nigerians wherein Shell has not been a friend to Nigerians in the exploitation of, in the you know, the bringing out of oil. So I think it was during my college years that I really began to find my voice and begin to find ways wherein I not only want to feel that God loves me, but that God loves Black people, and that I have a responsibility to do whatever I can to make a difference. And I was a Black history undergrad major. So it all kind of unfolded at that time.
Thank you for letting us have a peek into that process. I want to go a little deeper now, Reverend. And the question that I want to ask, because as I looked through the book, and really was just joy to kind of see how much terrain you covered. And anyone who really wants to have an opportunity between two covers to cover all that terrain, they should get this book. But one of the things that I would be very curious to hear you talk about is, what is Black protest? And I'm going to pose it in such a way that, you know, people think of movements, protests. You're on the Mall, the March on Washington in '63, thousands of people. But is that always, or the sum total of Black protests? I'm reminded of Rosa Parks, who stood up by sitting down. Could you tell us a little bit about how you look at Black protest and what we should think about when we think of Black protests?
Yeah, I think about Black protests and protests in general as resistance to oppression. And just as you said, in a multiplicity of ways. It's not always marching up and down the street. And especially, you know, when I talk to congregations and I tell them, well, you know, I've had 4 actions of civil disobedience where I've been arrested, protest. I said, you don't have to get arrested in order to protest. You just have to resist oppression. And sometimes it happens through a conversation that you have with someone else who says something ugly based on a racial stereotype. Sometimes it happens through refusing to be a part of a mentality that looks down on someone for such superficial reasons as their race, whether they're a migrant, immigrant to this country, whether they are gay or lesbian, their sexuality, for these reasons wherein we are expressing who we are. And so I really think that, and especially during slavery, it was amazing. You could lose your life if you openly protested. So the enslaved were experts on how to protest without it being noticed. You know, we have this whole conversation about the ways in which the slaves resisted. They would break tools intentionally. So, well, we can't work today. And the slave holders would say that the slaves will steal. According to the slaves, I earned this. You know, I'm the one who's raising these crops. I'm the one who's doing all the labor. So therefore, I should be able to partake of some of the produce that is being produced. But so that's a form of protest. Any resistance to oppression that one and oftentimes it has to be ongoing, because there's no one act of resistance that is going to achieve your goal. But you have to make sure that you have justice at the center of what you are doing, that you are either trying to defend yourself, You're trying to defend someone else, and to make sure that their rights are upheld. And so this whole sense that we are all children of God, made in the image of likeness of God, that we are not the same because we have different gifts, we have different abilities, but we are one in the eyes of God, that God is not partial towards any person. And that at the heart and center of my protest is that I serve and love a God of justice, that justice is a part of the nature of God. Justice is a part of the very being of God. And because I am created in the image of likeness of God, I am called to be just towards all people and to demand justice. And one of the things I would say, you're not only protesting, resisting individuals, but institutions as well, governments as well, because oftentimes most of the destruction comes from governments and from institutions because they have long-lasting and far-reaching impact. And so any resistance that you can put forth in a way that works within your context.
The Bible refers to princes and principalities.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what Theo is going to do when he starts to raise some of the questions that have come in that I've seen in the chat. You've got a huge audience and you've got some very complex questions. I'm just going to let Theo work on that part. So with the time that I have remaining, I've just got a couple more things I hope we can illuminate. First, speaking to the audience that you have tonight and to America in Black History Month at this moment in 2023, if you would you talk about the role of protest, not just Black protest, but protest as a necessary tool and as a patriotic expression?
Yes.
Would
yes.
you elaborate on that?
I love now, I think as people of color, as African Americans, whatever your racial ethnicity might be, we're torn by the Constitution, and so that 3/4 clause that defined Black people as 3/5 of a person. But overall, there are some wonderful, the Constitution on paper is a remarkable document. It really is in human history. And so it guarantees you the right to protest. And so this country was founded in protest. As a matter of fact, it's intimate to the life and nature. And even though I think in this day and time, there's a lot of confusion, about what is right protest and what is not protest. And some of these militia groups are protesting against anything that the government does, especially when it aligns with progress, cultural progress for marginalized communities. They think that's an infringement on their rights, which it is not. But as an American, we almost are it's bred into us that you have a right to do this, a right to speak out, a right to be an individual. I do think we've gotten carried away with it because we do need to adopt also a we mentality, a we consciousness, not just about my individual rights, but it's about our individual rights. But it's kind of inbred into who we are as Americans. And so I think that as I read American history in particular, protest has been in every era in this country. There's been an element of protest and it's been consistent. Oftentimes, the government has been on the wrong side, and the government has not necessarily fulfilled its responsibility. Again, starting with the founders, we know about Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was just, he had no struggle with oppression. He wanted to be an aristocrat. He didn't care whether it was through having slaves or whatever. Sally Hemings, the relationship or from his side of the relationship, from her side, she was enslaved, so she had no choice. But we see that with George Washington in particular, as we call the father of the country, I think Washington had more of a mentality where he took very seriously the words that were on paper. He never was able to reach a point wherein he could stand for the liberty and justice, but he was surrounded by people who did. And so we see again with Jefferson had pushed back from Benjamin Banneker, who said, man, you are crazy. You don't believe Black people are equal to white people. That's the most foolish thing I've ever heard in my life. And so one of the things that in dealing with your question, it's always been there. And people will make excuses for say, well, Washington and Jefferson lived in a certain time when it was a different day. In some ways, yes, but in many ways, no. There's always been opposing voices to oppression from marginalized communities and from within the white community. You know, whites have been allies in Black protests. You look at the Jewish community during the Civil Rights Movement. You look at the Quakers during the enslavement period. And so we have wherein it's always there. It's not always covered. For example, in DC, I work for the National Church, Presbyterian Church, two offices, the Washington office, we deal with federal public policy, and then the UN office, we deal with global public policy. And so we have been doing this work for 70 years. Many Presbyterians don't know these offices exist, you know, and this is church-led protest. And so I say all of this to say is that to be an American is to have a sense that protest is your right. Now, it does not mean that protests will be received in a just manner. It does not mean there will not be resistance to your right to protest demanding justice for all, but it's almost a part of our makeup. And again, for me, I even see that there's a larger call from God that supersedes the American call, because I get clarity from God's call for justice, because God has a different understanding of justice in the American context or even in the human context. And so I do think that as this country has unfolded, protest has always been there, and it has benefited this country. And again, America is on a journey. And it's amazing to me because, again, I assume that you're a little older than I am, but, you know, we know how far, just a little bit, how far this country has come in a short period of time, that Jim Crow has been eradicated to a large degree. We know we're not naive. America's not perfect, but it's a different day. It is a much different day. And again, we still have struggles to overcome. We still have a need for protest and resistance, but we see the impact that protest has had. And so America is still evolving due to protests in this country.
Reverend Hawkins, I'm going to step aside now. Theo is going to bring in some questions from the body, but I just want to thank you for this opportunity to kick it with you. I've enjoyed it a great deal.
I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, both of you. What a great start to the conversation. Thank you, Don, for those great questions. And we'll just continue our discussion with some of the things that have come in from folks in the audience. And there are a whole range of things, as Don mentioned. Let me just start with one, a little bit about the research you did, Jimmie, in terms of one question was, how did you find some of the stories of early resistance? Because a lot of these people have tried to bury these things. And did you find some particularly reliable sources? And also, was there anything you found that was particularly surprising to you, a kind of a protest you weren't aware of that happened that really struck you in your research?
Yeah, and again, I want to thank Don for his wonderful conversation with me. And so, Theo, if you see behind me, I began this writing right a couple of years before the pandemic. Since my early years in college, I've been buying books. I've always loved to read, always loved books. And so I collected all of these books, primarily 85% of them on Black history. So when I began writing, I had a library of about 500 books on Black history that I could use. And the Lord led me early. I would collect articles about Black history. I mean, I have a huge set of boxes in my closet of articles. So many of the articles that I gave reference to, I had the actual copies in my library. And so I had the background for the research to be done. And again, I was a Black history major in undergrad. And so I had an overall understanding of Black history. But I think, again, the catalyst for this specific focus was Kaepernick's protest and the response to him. And what was the second part of the question?
Was there something that particularly inspired or surprised you in your research?
Yeah, and I make mention of this, how Black protest, by and large, has been leaderless. And I think we think about Martin Luther King Jr., but, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. only lived for 39 years. And so we're talking about centuries of Black protests and how the masses of Black people resisted. And for example, again, the periods of great migration. We know that during World War, around 1914, World War I, Black migration to the West and to the North started. In the 1970s, it began to be reversed. And now we have reverse migration where Blacks are leaving the North and South and going back, North and West and going back to the South. And so it was almost as if the Spirit of God was moving from community to community saying, do this. And you look at, for example, Black voting. Blacks vote primarily for Democrats. And I don't think it's because they are loyal to the Democratic Party, but they see that the issues of the Democratic Party align more with their issues. There's no one out there saying, vote this way. But Black people are en masse trying to decide, how do I navigate life in America? And so to see how Black people en masse, and again, we're not monolithic. We are not all Democrats. We're not don't all live in one place. We don't all think the same way. But I think to see how Black people have acted in very specific ways to resist, to protest, to try to improve their life. And once it started, it took over the country. Slave plantations had an information network from plantation to plantation, because we know that artisans who were enslaved had freedom to move from plant. And there were Blacks who worked the waterways. And so they would carry information intentionally from plantation to plantation. And so I think it was Samuel Adams said that Blacks have a network system of communication that is unrivaled in this country. And so the way in which Black people have really tried to rally together, again, without signature leadership for much of the period in this history, and have really tried, despite all of the resistance, institutional resistance, have tried to really work together with each other.
Tracy Wise Quick has a question. She picked up on me mentioning in the introduction that you had worked with Moral Monday and some with Poor People's Campaign. And the question is, what have you learned from collaborating with Bishop Barber, and what have you learned about protest in terms of your experience with in North Carolina and with the larger work he's done?
Yeah, I would not necessarily say, I would say it more helped me to enforce what I already believe, to manifest what I already believe. I was with the Moral Monday campaign from 2013 to 2016 from the beginning. I was with the first group when Barber called 19 of us to go to Jones Street in Raleigh to be arrested, and it started that movement that summer. And then with the Poor People's Campaign, we're still engaged with the Poor People's Campaign. So it's more of a manifestation of what I believe about being a person of faith. For me, it was a decision that as a person of faith, I wanted to be engaged, not simply in protest, but to be engaged in challenging the powers to be to be more just, to have laws, especially in North Carolina at that time. Extremists took over both houses and the governorship, and they came up with these draconian laws in North Carolina. And I really, what motivated me was to, my son had got meningitis when he was 9 months old, our son, and we had health insurance. I had health insurance, my wife had health insurance. And so the governor of the state of North Carolina said, well, when the ACA first came out, he says, well, we might need to look at this. He was a Republican governor. And I still remember distinctly, he said it right before the weekend. He says, this looks like a pretty good deal. On that Monday, he released a statement. He says, no, I'm going to oppose the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. We don't want to have anything to do with it. And in my mind, that was the last straw right there. And so Barber came through on April the 28th to Durham, where I was pastor, and he preached at Pilgrim Disciples of Christ Church. And I went because I've known Barber since 1992. We both were in Martinsville, Virginia. And so we were friends since that time. And so I went over and he says, well, we're going to Jones Street tomorrow. Who wants to go with me? And so I raised my hand. And so 19 of us went and were arrested. But again, it was a manifestation of what I believed about being a person of faith, that you cannot talk about God's grace and have faith in a God and not be concerned about what's going on here on earth. That it's not just a vertical relationship with God, but God calls us to a vertical understanding that God is with us here in this plane, but to have a horizontal relationship with other people here. And so I do think that's one of the gifts of the Black church. The Black church has always had a prophetic voice, wherein it never was satisfied just talking about the institution of the church, that we should be engaged in the life of the church, but it actually, you are the church, and it goes beyond, and you have a responsibility to witness to your faith in the public arena. And that's really what we call the Washington office, office of witnesses to faith in the public arena. So I think it's more of a manifestation. I don't think it necessarily brought out anything in me, but it helped me to express what was already there.
There's a question from Claire Jerry about the Black oratorical tradition in protest. You mentioned that one of the things that struck you was that so much of this was leaderless. It was more spontaneous, but there has been also a role played by charismatic leaders and oratory. Just say a bit about that. Is that you notice how that evolved at different times? Is that important early on, the Black oratorical tradition that we think of now in terms of modern civil rights? What did you find in that regard?
Oh yeah, and it's really fascinating because the many Africans who came here, they passed their history on through oratory. We have the griots, who are the historians, and they basically pass it on by word of mouth. It was not through the written language, even though there were African countries that had written languages. The Egyptians had written language, but that became a part of the culture here, wherein you had to express it because one, during the antebellum period, during slavery, it was illegal to teach Blacks to read and write. And most, by far, the vast majority, even after slavery ended, were illiterate. And so it became hand in hand, where it was cultural, but also out of necessity. So you had to express yourself in a way that was able to communicate what you were attempting to say. And so I do think that is a part of the Black experience. And I do see what's fascinating to me. I did a little study of the impact of the Black preaching style on the American preaching style, especially in white churches, wherein more and more white clergy are adopting what we would traditionally call a Black oratory style. Less manuscripts, more expressive, using stories a lot more, and to communicate where you're not concentrating, you're concentrating on the content, but also on the display and the way it's done. So it's really interesting. And I still remember there were churches that used to attend different churches when I pastored in Durham and was on vacation. And I noticed more and more white preachers were adopting what I would classify as a Black preaching style. But I do think that Blacks also, as Blacks have gained literacy, you see a greater a mixture now. And again, I think in the Black community, the Black community is focusing also on the written text to a larger degree, especially for purposes of scholarship. We have PhDs now who are writing just wonderful papers and books on different subjects. And so again, I see a mixture wherein whites are becoming more focused on oratory and Blacks are becoming more focused on academia. And so it's going to be an interesting merger. And I do think the merger is pretty much occurring now, and it's impacting the rest of the world, wherein we do see America is a testing ground for many of the theories in a lot of different fields that happen. And I think that preaching is one of those.
There's a question from someone in Tennessee, Lynn McFarland, about how their governor in Tennessee uses civility and the need for civility as a way to put down protesters. Sort of, I won't deal with you unless you're polite. Mm-hmm. You comment on that a little bit, and how do you respond? How can people respond to show respect, perhaps, to others, but still protest and not be boxed in by this call for just be more civil? Yeah.
And we know it's a means of control. He's trying to control people, saying to come up with a reason why he won't deal with certain people and why he will deal with other people. I do think that when we are protesting, we need to be very clear, one, in what are the justice issues we are addressing. And also, I think we have to go beyond addressing the issue. We also have to provide some type of a remedy. What do we want? You know, we're here because there's an injustice, but what is needed to be done to change that injustice? But I also will say not to allow people to control us and they determine every level of engagement. And I think that there's legitimate pushback. Again, if he can say, well, so-and-so came into my office, laid me out, cursed me out, then obviously that's not productive. But if he's using it as a means to say with whom he's going to have conversations with, there's got to be pushback from a multiplicity of communities, where it's not just a community that's been impacted, but we've got to make partnerships with we use the term marginalized communities, those who are left out. Because one of the things that I've found is that people know what they want. People who are impoverished, they have schools that don't have the funding, and oftentimes we have these conversations with ourselves. I'm a Presbyterian. I've pastored 4 different churches over the last 25 years. Many of our African-American Presbyterians are very educated. As a matter of fact, for a large period of time, the Black level of education in the Presbyterian Church was equal or higher than the white level, but many more master's degrees, PhDs, because it was that church attracted individuals with that type of a background. But also, even in that level, Black and white Presbyterians would talk to each other, but we wouldn't necessarily talk to impacted communities. And so we've got to find a way to make sure that everyone who is being impacted has a seat at the table. As a matter of fact, I would dare say that those of us who are not as directly impacted need to play a supporting role and have others at the forefront. But I do think we always have to give pushback when people try to set the rules in an unfair way. But we've got to have a variety of strategies. We just can't go in with one strategy and think that one strategy is going to win the day. And also to understand that this is, when you're fighting for justice, when you're protesting for justice, I encourage people to be ready for the long haul, because you're not going to have one conversation where all of a sudden everything changes. So you've got to be persistent and consistent. And also, again, have different strategies and be able to evolve as time goes on. I do think sometimes a little finesse works more. And so part of it is knowing the people that you're dealing with, but also understanding some people don't want to deal with you at all. So they're just looking for reasons not to. So sometimes you have to go around them and deal with individuals and find allies who have his or her ear, who hopefully can have an impact.
One of the things that struck me when reading your book was you talked about, particularly about the Harlem Renaissance as a major protest movement. At first, I didn't really quite understand that. And then I saw you phrase it was a protest against the idea of Black inferiority. Then you write about the hip hop movement and how important it has been in many ways. Maybe you just say a few things about the role of the arts in protest and why it's so important, why you see it as so important.
Oh, I love the arts. I mean, I wish I could sing, but I can't. I would end the webinar if I start singing right now. But the arts have been very important in the Black Renaissance. Harlem Renaissance is really an amazing time, because we have to be honest and we can't romanticize any people's history. We have things that we need to applaud, other things that we need to question. In the Black community, this whole sense of Blackness was controversial. And we know that the whole sense of passing, where lighter skinned Blacks would infiltrate the white community because they look so fair. And so there was almost a sense of implied being ashamed of being Black. A Black culture was deemed inferior. And what the Harlem Renaissance did was to say that Black is beautiful. Even before Stokely Carmichael in the Black Power movement said that during the 60s, and said that we will affirm our culture, our sense of identity, not based as a reflection of white culture or a sense of trying to be white, but because we are a unique people who have value. And so the Harlem Renaissance, again, it was the first time, and Alan Locke is called the father of the Harlem Renaissance. And he really pushed artists to talk about what it means to be Black, to talk about you have a sense of pride in your Blackness and in your culture that is not inferior. And so I do think that the arts are pivotal, because people will listen to a poem or listen to a song that's infiltrated with protest, even though it might oppose everything they believe and clap. You know, not necessarily always understanding, but I think the arts have a way of communicating the essence of protest in a way that really other avenues can't do. And I still remember Billie Holiday was sing Strange Fruit. We know that it was written by a Jewish lyricist. There are two things about that song. It's talking about lynching. And in some of the nightclubs that she would sing with, where she would sing with Taylor, don't sing that song. You know, my guests have told me they don't want to hear Strange Fruit, and they say she would always sing it, no matter what they would tell her. But it also had an impact upon her, and there's some of her friends would say that some of her addiction issues were tied in with the lyrics of that song, that it was a struggle for her to sing that song, but she recognized the importance of singing that song. And so I think that the arts are God's gift to us, wherein we can express ourselves in ways that go beyond words. I mean, sculpture, paintings, again, the words of books, poetry, in a way that connects us to one another. I mean, the Grammys were on the other night, and the diversity of the Grammys, people still fussing because Queen Bee didn't get Album of the Year. But, you know, but to see how much energy there is in that room and in this country, football, basketball. And so I do talk quite a bit about athletics and artists, because they have played a role in Black protests that I do think they were at the forefront of many of the movements. Martin Luther King Jr. would talk about how artists, Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, the role that they played in the movement for fundraising. Sammy Davis Jr., even though Sammy Davis Jr. was a Republican and he stuck with Nixon, things along that line, but he supported the civil rights movement. So I think protests and the arts go hand in hand, and it's really a wonderful vehicle.
Thank you so much. We are near the end of our time. I got to as many of the questions I could. Sorry, we didn't get to all of them, but this has been a really fascinating conversation, and I hope folks will read your book and dig deeper in some of this. As we close, let me just ask you maybe make some final remarks. There are a couple of questions about applying these lessons to the future and in our lives. One gentleman asked about applying it to the Asian American community. There are other communities out there. If you could just summarize a couple of moments of what you want to leave with us about lessons you've learned about the protest and how that's relevant to us as we go forward and try to be more effective in creating a more just society.
Yeah, and I really want to comment on the comment about the protests within the Asian community. One of the things that I say near the end of the book is that I do hope that it inspires every community, whether it's a racial ethnic community, to tell their story. I mean, because oftentimes, and I will share this in conversations that I have, oftentimes protest is laid out in a black-white binary, as if the only areas of injustice in this country are between blacks and whites, when obviously we know that's far from the truth, especially the further west you go across this country. By the time you get to California, black protests is minimal to Asian protests and Hispanic protests. And so I want every community to be inspired to tell their story. I mean, I've been doing research on other communities, and it's just as prolific. I mean, you look at the relationship with Hispanic Americans, in Mexican Americans, and in Central Americans, South Americans. They have played a strong role in protests in this country. It really is, in many ways, an even more so undiscovered story. And so I do hope that other communities are inspired by this type of work to say, we need to tell our story as well. And I also think that one of the things I also say, this is really just a summary. The book could be 10 volumes, There's so much that I really didn't have the capacity, because I wanted to keep it under 500 pages, to dwell into, in that the Black experience is so rich in this country. And especially when you begin reading about the Black towns, you begin reading about, again, the Black West, which is really it's just inspiring. I love the stories that are told and how much information there is out there. And so I would encourage all to try to broaden your understanding of the Black experience, that it does go beyond slavery and Jim Crow. And again, it goes beyond oppression and victimization, but that Black people have said, we count, and we too are America. We are part of the story of America. And we have had an impact upon this country in a very positive way. And so I hope that it is a stepping off point for people to tell their own stories.
Great. Jimmie, thank you so much. Wonderful discussion. Just great to hear from you and to get to talk with you about this. As we close, I want to pose a question for those of you listening in, and I urge you to take a moment. We're going to close here in 2 or 3 minutes, and just take a moment though and answer one or both of these questions in the chat. What did you learn about Black protest in America that was particularly interesting for you or helpful? And or what did you hear tonight that's helpful as you think about future efforts you may be involved in or you care about to protest injustice? So just take up some time and write in some response to those questions. I find that if you write out some insights you get from a meeting like this, it helps you remember them more, and it helps us to see too that what was particularly helpful for you. So we'll keep the chat open even for a minute or two after we close for you to write in, type in some answers to those, one or both of those questions. A couple of other announcements. The first announcement is just to remind you to buy a copy of Reverend Jimmie Hawkins' book. It's a wonderful resource for if you want a summary and a sense of the different elements of protest, Black protest in our country's history. And if you're going to be involved in educational projects in your church or club or organization or school, it's a great resource. So I really encourage you to buy that. Next, I want to just quickly let you know about our next McClendon Scholar Program. It'll be a webinar on Wednesday, March 15th. The guest will be Dr. John Haught, Professor Emeritus at Georgetown. Dr. Haught is a theologian who specializes in the area of religion and science. And he's going to give a very interesting presentation about new discoveries in science and how that may impact our understanding and thinking about God. And we'll be sending information out about this in the near future. The final thing I want to say is that we are recording this program. Recording will be available. Some of you have asked about that in the chat. We will send a link to this recording to everyone who registered, and it will be on the McClendon Scholar website within the next couple of days. You can also find there recordings of all the other programs we've had, remarkable speakers that we've had over the last several years, and all of those can be accessed from that website. So nyapc.org/McClendon-SIR will take you to that, and you'll can access this program and look at all of the others we've had in the past. So again, thank you for your participation. For a benediction, I want to read a paragraph from Reverend Hawkins' book, from near the end of his book, serve as our benediction for the evening. And he writes the following. So what is Black protest? It is truth-telling. It understands that America has always been a nation of contradictions and hypocrisy. America has never lived up to its proclamations of liberty and justice for all, but African Americans have found that American democratic ideals are worth fighting for. The focus of protest has never been to change the nation's creed, but to compel the country to live up to its own values and profess beliefs. Black protest is inclusion. For the majority of Black people, the goal has never been to separate from other races, but to ensure that a diversity of people are afforded opportunity and access to life's benefits and blessings. Thank you for attending this evening, and I wish you a good night.